Roger Baldwin, who is a professor of cooperative extension from the Department of Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology at UC Davis. And he will be presenting on vertebrate pest management in vineyards. Welcome, Roger. See you putting that together.
We're getting there
Yeah, no worries.
here. Let's see. Okay, can you see that now, Cindy?
I can. It's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Good morning, everybody. So we're going to talk about furry critters here this morning, I guess. In particular, an integrated approach to managing vertebrate pests. So I thought we'd start off by providing a little bit of background information into the different species that we're going to be focusing on for this presentation this morning. And one of the ones that I want to talk about today is the California ground squirrel. I'm sure that most, if not all of you, are familiar with what ground squirrels look like, but just as a quick refresher, they are grayish brown in color and have a semi-bushy tail. If you look closely, they also have a mottled or speckled type appearance that you can use to differentiate them from, say, some of our tree squirrel species. Now, ground squirrels are social. That means they do live together in groups, and so that makes it a little bit easier for us to find them out there on the landscape and see them causing damage. Certainly, they can cause quite a bit of damage. That damage can be quite extensive and quite varied. It does include girdling of vines and trees. So here's an example of a tree they've crawled up into and fed on the cambium layer or the bark of that particular tree. They eat nuts and fruits directly, of course, and other kinds of forage on the ground. They chew on irrigation lines, which results in millions of dollars annually throughout the state. And then their abundant burrow openings cause all kinds of issues as well, whether that be by serving as a tripping hazard, by potential damage to farm equipment. We can see increased soil erosion from water channeling down through those burrow systems. So lots of potential issues associated with ground squirrel burrow systems. Now, ground squirrels are a diurnal species, and that means that they are active during the daytime. So again, it makes it pretty easy for us to see them out there on the landscape and know that they're potentially causing issues. And as their name would imply, they do live in burrow systems. Sometimes those burrow systems are up and underneath structures, such as this example here at the top right. Obviously, that's a potential problematic situation. But we can find burrow systems in a variety of different locations, including along field edges, fence rows, roadsides, next to the base of trees, scenarios like that. Those are some good areas to key in on when initially looking for ground squirrel activity at a particular site. That being said, once they become well established in an area, you will find them burrow systems just about anywhere. We're also going to talk about pocket gophers today. Gophers are burrowing rodents as well. They're about 6 to 8 inches in length on average. But of course, gophers spend the vast majority of their life below ground. So for us to know that they're present in a particular location, we have to look for some other form of sign. And the sign that we're typically looking for with gophers are their mounds. The photo at the bottom right is an example of what a typical mound will look like, usually horseshoe-shaped in appearance with a plug towards the lower end of one side of that mound. Contrast that to the photo at the bottom left, which is an example of a mole mound. Mole mounds tend to be more conical or volcano-shaped in appearance with a plug either right in the middle of the mound, or sometimes you just simply don't see a plug associated with the mound. Just keep in mind that moles and gophers are quite different. Moles are insectivores, therefore they're eating worms and grubs and such, whereas gophers are rodents. And so rodents, feed directly on plant material. So gophers tend to cause a lot more damage than moles do. So that's all we're going to talk about for moles today. But if anybody has questions at the end, if there's time, I'd be happy to answer those. Now, as far as damage from gophers is concerned, probably the most common form of damage is just simply the direct feeding of the taproot, which can weaken and or kill those plants. Particularly young vines and young trees are very susceptible to this kind of damage. Likewise, gophers can also girdle trees and vines below ground. And this photo at the top right is an example of what that girdling damage can look like. If it extends all the way around the tree, then that will lead to mortality of that tree. So this obviously is a very difficult type of damage to deal with, just like the damage to the root systems, because you don't know that it's occurring until you start to see a loss in vigor of that particular tree or vine. And if that happens, once you see that loss in vigor, then that's probably too late. You're probably going to lose that particular plant. And of course, when you have trees or vines planted in rows, then you can lose quite a few pretty quickly that way. Then, of course, their mounds and burrow systems can cause extensional issues as well. In some cases, they can kill plants directly just by burying them. They can certainly create weed seed beds when they're bringing that soil up to the surface. And oftentimes, it's going to contain weed seed, right? And so we can see that proliferation of weeds associated with those mounds. The mounds also will cause tripping hazards, potential damage to farm equipment, and increased soil erosion. And this photo at the bottom right is an example of a vineyard where there was, gopher tunnel systems going up and down the road, and water, and it's on a slope, and so water just started channeling down through and causing this kind of erosion issue. We're also going to talk about meadow voles today. Voles are also sometimes referred to as meadow mice. So if you're more familiar with that term, we are talking about the same animal here. Voles are usually dark grayish brown in color and about 4 to 6 inches in length. So size-wise, if you think about it, they're actually a little bit larger than your standard house mouse or deer mouse, probably 2 to 3 times the size of them, but they are definitely smaller than an average gopher or a rat, so a little bit intermediate in size there. The really challenging aspect about voles is that their populations do tend to cycle. And what that means is you can have relatively low densities of voles in a particular area for several years. And then all of a sudden, when conditions get just right, those populations can really explode. And it can lead to those situations where you feel like you are literally being overrun by voles. And it's in those situations in which voles cause a tremendous amount of damage. Incidentally, this was one of the worst vole years in my 16 years in California. So I'm sure that some of you probably experienced some vole issues this last year. Now, voles do live in burrow systems as well. In contrast to gophers, though, vole burrow systems tend to be open, usually about an inch to inch and a half diameter openings to their burrow systems. And here's an example of what some of those can look like. Voles also have these runways that go back and forth to connect those burrow entrances. And these runways are a really good diagnostic to let you know that voles are present out there on the landscape. And if you look closely, you can look for some information to let you know if those burrow systems and runways are active, simply looking to see if the fecal pellets are fresh on it, if you have fresh grass clippings, things along those lines. As far as damage is concerned, from voles, they also will girdle trees and vines. Usually this girdling damage is above ground for voles, though. But it doesn't extend very high. Voles are not good climbers. And so usually you'll see vole girdling damage from ground level up to maybe 6 to 8 inches above ground. And they'll consume other types of vegetation directly. They will chew on irrigation, drip tape, tubing, etc. as well. The last one we're going to talk just a little bit about today are deer. Deer can also cause significant damage when they're present in a particular area, usually through their browsing activity or perhaps through some rubbing of antlers. Deer are primarily a crepuscular and nocturnal species. Crepuscular simply meaning active during low light periods, and then, of course, nocturnal meaning active at night. That being said, if deer get habituated to human presence in a particular area, and do not perceive you as a threat, then they will be active during the daytime as well. But when they're active at night and at those low light periods, then you oftentimes have to look for sign to know that deer were the species responsible for causing damage, and that can include looking for footprints, pellet groups that they leave behind, and other forms of sign. And when it comes to managing these species, we do certainly recommend that individuals utilize an integrated approach. With an integrated approach, we're talking about the use of multiple strategies. You will generally find better results if you use multiple strategies than if you were to rely on any single one approach. Now, depending upon the species that we're talking about, there's a variety of different tools that could be used. And so, for one example, with gophers, maybe you initially go with a bait application, such as strychnine, to knock down that population, and then follow that up a few weeks later with a trapping program to remove some of the remaining individuals out there in that particular area. The important point here again, though, is to think about mixing and matching those tools, because we have to keep in mind that not all individuals in a population are going to be equally susceptible to any particular tool. A great example would be trapping. Some individuals, some gophers out there just might be very trap shy, and that might be difficult to get them. So if you only use trapping, you might have a hard time getting some of those individuals, and over time, that proportion that's trap shy may grow. Likewise, baiting. Not all gophers in a population want to consume bait. And so if you're only using baiting, then over time that proportion is going to increase. So mixing and matching is very important. It's also important to understand a little bit about the biology of the species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, as that can greatly influence the efficacy of management programs as well. And this chart, I think, does a really good job of illustrating this. This chart was designed specifically for California ground squirrels. And what we see on this chart are major activity periods for ground squirrels, major food resources, and then the best time for control for three of the more commonly used strategies for managing ground squirrels. Of course, this is broken down across the different seasons of the year. So what do we notice when we look at this chart? Well, one of the first things that I notice is that there's a couple of different food resources that ground squirrels utilize throughout the year, but they're utilizing them at different times. So for example, when ground squirrels come out of hibernation in late winter through springtime, they're eating primarily green foliage because that's what's available and it's high in nitrogen, therefore a good protein resource for ground squirrels. This is important, or an important consideration, because if you think about baiting, which is a tool that we do commonly use for ground squirrel control, we have to keep in mind that those baits are usually seed or pelletized type products. So if we want to maximize the effectiveness of a baiting program, we need to wait until later in the year when ground squirrels actively switch to eating seeds. But once that green foliage senesces, it dries out, it creates seeds, and that's when the ground squirrels start feeding on those seeds. So baiting works best when they're actively feeding on those particular products. But that doesn't mean we can't control ground squirrels in late winter, early spring. And in fact, that's a really good time to manage them. It's just that we have to focus on different tools. And one of the tools we might focus on then are the burrow fumigants. Burrow fumigants utilize toxic gases within burrow systems. And because it's gases, they can dissipate quite easily through cracks and pores in the soil. But in winter through early spring, being a Mediterranean climate, that's when we get most of our natural precipitation. That wet soil closes off those pores and cracks and holds those toxic gases in at a much greater rate. So fumigation works really well during that time of the year. But as soils start to dry out, then it no longer works very well. So these are just a couple of examples of how knowing a little bit about the biology of the species that you're trying to manage, as well as the ecology of the system that you're working in, can greatly influence the efficacy of our management programs. So with that, let's jump into a discussion of some of the different tools that are out there for managing the species we're talking about today. And this chart is meant to give you an idea of what some of those potential tools are. And one of the first things you'll notice is that there are some tools that can be used for all species, at least to some extent, whereas there are others that are pretty limited on when they might be used. Habitat modification, for example, tends to be one that can be used in a wide variety of situations. Conversely, frightening devices are only potentially effective against deer, and even then, it's questionable efficacy. Usually only works for a few days. For example, playing a radio around a particular area might scare deer away for a few days, but probably isn't going to keep them away long term. So these question marks are usually, indicative of situations where there might be some limited utility, but not particularly effective. Or in the case of some of these repellents, maybe there's a lot that we don't know about them. So we'll talk about a lot of this as we move throughout the rest of our time here this morning. Two items, though, that I'm not going to talk any more about are the frightening devices, which I already touched on for deer, and then shooting. Shooting is a tool that can be used to help manage ground squirrel populations, but it does require persistent effort. You can't just shoot a few ground squirrels and consider that effective management. For effective management for most of these rodent species, we're looking at 70 to 90% reductions in populations, and that's difficult to do with shooting. It can be done if you're very persistent, but in most cases, there's better options. And so we're not going to talk too much about that. Likewise with deer, it is technically possible to get a depredation permit to remove deer in certain situations, but it's very difficult to attain one of those depredation permits. You would first have to show that you've tried most of the other tools out there and they simply aren't working for you. And usually benefits from removal of deer through a depredation permit are pretty short term. So you're usually better off focusing on some other tools. Now, the previous chart that I had up there was by no means all inclusive. There are some other tools that can be used as well to help manage some of these vertebrate species. And one of the tools that is oftentimes discussed is biocontrol. Of course, with biocontrol, we're talking about the use of natural predators to help control pest populations. When it comes to biocontrol for vertebrates, typically what we think of are the barn owls. Barn owls tend to be the poster child for vertebrate management. Um, the reasons why we focus on barn owls are multifaceted, but realistically probably come down to two primary reasons. And the first reason is simply that barn owls are very efficient predators of small rodents. We see upwards of 3,000 or more burrowing rodents removed in a given year by one breeding pair. So they certainly can remove lots of rodents. The second reason that we focus on barn owls is because they are relatively non-territorial species. This is important because that means we can put up barn owl boxes in relatively high densities in a particular area and get barn owls to utilize those boxes. And then if they're utilizing those boxes, then hopefully they will go ahead and hunt in some of those areas to help reduce some of those pest populations. The big question, historically has been, um, can the high predation rates that barn owls engage in, is that substantial enough to actually reduce the high reproductive output of some of these rodent species? And so there has been some work that's been done over the last few years beginning to address this, primarily led by Matt Johnson out of Cal Poly Humboldt, but I've assisted to some extent on some of these projects as well. And what we've been finding out is that um, barn owls have had some potential benefit when it comes to reduction in pocket gopher populations, particularly in vineyards. And we've also seen some effect on mouse populations. We're not really focusing on mice today, but they have had an impact on mice as well. We're still not, it's still not clear what kind of impact they might have on voles. We haven't really been able to test that effectively. But the take-home message here is that we are seeing some population reductions by barn owls of gophers and mice. And so that's a real positive. Do keep in mind, though, that these reductions, you're not going to take a high density population and drive them to zero. Okay. First of all, they're not going to be able to remove all of their food resource, or they wouldn't continue to be able to exist in that area. But secondly, once populations begin to get depressed to some extent, they're going to move elsewhere to hunt. So you may be looking at a 10, 20, 30% reduction in numbers in areas that are moderate density. Probably better results in areas where you're already dealing with relatively low densities. So perhaps some of the greatest utility of barn owls might actually be in those situations where, let's say, you have a gopher population and you utilize a bait application, fumigation, trapping program, whatever, to reduce that population to a relatively low density, then utilize and hopefully be able to rely on barn owls to help keep those populations from rebounding. And so I think that's where maybe some of their greatest utility might be. Now, we do also hear about, uh, the placement of raptor perches as well to help to try to control ground squirrel populations. Because keep in mind, ground squirrels are diurnal species, barn owls are nocturnal, right? So they're not existing in the same time scales. And so barn owls are not going to have an impact on ground squirrel populations, but diurnal raptors, in theory, perhaps could because they're existing in the same timescales. But um, to date, I have not seen any data at all that suggests that diurnal raptors are effective at reducing ground squirrel populations in a particular area. Doesn't mean you can't utilize raptor perches to try to encourage their presence in a particular area. Certainly, the removal of even one or two individuals might be, beneficial for you all, but it's not going to constitute effective management. You're going to need, uh, more broad scale reductions than that. But again, it doesn't hurt to include them as part of an IPM program. Another tool that's oftentimes utilized to help manage vertebrate species is habitat modification. And with habitat modification, we're talking about altering the desirability of an area for a particular pest species. And there's lots of examples that we can provide for habitat modification for the animals that we're talking about today. But let's talk about a few of them. Some of them fall into the categories of cultural practices as well. And an example of that is burrow destruction. So let's think about, an orchard setting where you have ground squirrels. Let's say you have extensive ground squirrel problems and you decide to implement, some kind of management tool to get rid of those ground squirrels. And let's assume that you're just wonderfully successful and you get rid of every ground squirrel out there. Well, that's great, but the likelihood is that your neighbors probably are not near as effective as you were at managing their ground squirrel populations. And when you get rid of your ground squirrels, you're getting rid of the ground squirrels, but the burrow systems are still there. And so it serves as, a big neon flashing sign that says, "Hey, here's all these new homes for you other folks to come try out." And so what we oftentimes see is pretty rapid reinvasion of ground squirrels following a depopulation event. And one way that we can substantially slow down that reinvasion is by destroying those old burrow systems. And a predecessor of mine, Terry Selman, found out years ago that burrow destruction was very effective at reducing reinvasion. It reduced reinvasion by 90% over the course of an entire year. So it can be a very good tool. The downside is that for ground squirrels in particular, those burrow systems, burrow destruction has to be pretty thorough. He found that you had to rip the soil down to 1.5 feet in depth in order to destroy those old burrow systems. So it definitely has limited applicability, probably not a practical tool in an orchard or a vineyard that's, under current production. But if you're taking one of those orchards or vineyards out of production and going to replant and you had extensive ground squirrel problems, that's a good time to go through and rip up those old sites to 1.5 feet in depth. And that can help you to, gain a leg up on those ground squirrel populations as you replant. Flood irrigation is another tool that has a lot of utility when it comes to managing burrowing rodent species. What happens when you have a flood irrigation event is that forces all of those rodents up to the surface. And so here we have a great example of egrets and raptors of various sorts, coyotes, and even a heron, blue heron that's going to walk into the screen here in a second. And you're going to see that almost every single one of these out here during the course of this video finds a rodent to consume. And so this is just a great example of how, flooding in a particular area can be a great way to help minimize potential problems with these burrowing rodent species. Now, of course, we've lost the ability to utilize flood irrigation in many areas, but some folks do still maintain the capability of utilizing flood irrigation. And if you do, periodic flood irrigation events can be a great way to help mitigate potential problems with some of these burrowing rodent species. And then another example, probably one of the best examples we have of how habitat modification can help us deal with some of these vertebrate issues pertains to voles. Voles are a very cover-dependent species. If they do not have sufficient cover in a particular area, then they are too susceptible to natural predation and they will move on to other locations. So, for example, if you had a vineyard with a cover crop, some steps that you could take to help reduce potential problems with voles would be to, first of all, keep a vegetation-free zone around the base of all of your vines or trees if we're talking about an orchard setting. That's one great way to help reduce girdling damage. And then when it comes to the cover crop, if you can keep that mowed low, preferably to 2 inches of stubble height or less, that will further curtail any potential problems that you might have with voles. So do keep this in mind. If you're somebody, excuse me, somebody who has extensive problems with voles, unfortunately, voles are one of those species where we do not have many tools that are effective. But one of the tools that does work quite well is habitat modification. So if you have extensive vole problems, you really need to stay on top of the cover out there and keep that at to a minimum level. Now we can also use exclusion too. Exclusion tends to be a very effective tool when it comes to keeping some of these animals out of particular areas, but it also is oftentimes the most expensive of the options. And so, it's not for all situations, but in those kind of situations where you continually experience substantial damage from certain species, then exclusion might be a good option for you. And deer are an example of one of those species where you might incorporate exclusion because we don't have a whole lot of tools when it comes to mitigating damage from deer. So if you have a situation where deer continually cause problems for you, maybe you're next to a riparian area, for example, and the deer move from that riparian area into an orchard or a vineyard, then fencing, that orchard or vineyard can definitely provide you substantial relief. But the fencing structures have to be pretty substantive. If you're using a straight fence, it usually has to be at least 8 feet tall in order to keep deer from jumping over it. There's some other designs, though. Some of these angle designs are utilized in certain areas. It's basically taking advantage of the fact that, deer can't just go from a standing jump and up and over really high structures or really wide structures. And so having an angled fence like this sometimes can provide the relief you're looking for. Conversely, combining a vertical plus an angle component, a vertical fence plus an angle component can help keep them from jumping over without having to have such a tall fence. And this is an example of that where, this fence might be 5 or 6 feet tall and then another couple foot or 1 foot angle, depending upon where you're at, can be enough to keep the deer from being able to jump over it. There's also some shorter term solutions. Here's an example of one that was put out by the Clemson Cooperative Extension Unit where they're utilizing electrified poly tape, where this tape extends a little bit above ground, in this case, 1.5 to 2 feet above ground. Then you got a 2 to 4 foot area in between before you have a more extensive fencing structure behind that. Here's what that looks like in action. And so basically the way this works is, the deer comes up to the fence. It's now too wide for it to have a running jump to jump over in most cases. But they also can't, they can crawl under and get in between it or step over and get over the top, depending upon the height that you utilize. But it's too tall now for them to jump over from a standing jump kind of a situation. And of course, being electrified, if they touch it, they get zapped and they run away. So this kind of device or this kind of fencing approach can be effective for short term. It's probably not something you're going to want to utilize for years on end. If you're going to utilize something like that, you'd want a more permanent fencing structure. But if you're looking for more temporary relief, then this kind of fencing approach could also work. Now, we can also use exclusion for voles too, particularly if trying to protect the trunks of newly planted trees or vines. This is accomplished by utilizing a hard plastic trunk guard. The challenge with these, though, is that you do need to bury those trunk guards below ground, preferably at least 6 inches below ground. If you just place them on the top of the soil, you can actually increase damage as opposed to not utilizing them at all, because you basically created the perfect environment for voles where they can simply crawl underneath that structure, crawl up, and now they have both shelter and an abundant food resource. So if you do decide to utilize these chunk guards, just make sure that you're utilizing them appropriately by burying them below ground. But obviously, putting a bunch of these hundreds, if not thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of them out there on the landscape can be quite extensive, quite challenging from a labor perspective and from a cost perspective. So, wouldn't it be nice if we had a repellent instead that we could spray around the base of these trees that could keep vole damage down? That might be a quicker and more cost-effective approach. And so we looked at this a few years ago with a repellent called anthraquinone. Keep in mind, there's various different kinds of repellents out there. There are some that are fear-inducing. There are some that have bitter taste, some that elicit a pain response, like capsaicin, something really spicy, etc. And most of these have historically not worked well against rodent species. But there's another type of repellent too, and those are called post-ingestive products. And what these are products that the animal consumes one time, but then that causes them to get sick, and they learn to avoid feeding on that again in the future because they got sick. And anthraquinone is an example of that. So we did some initial lab testing and found that anthraquinone had a lot of promise as a potential vole repellent. And so we then took it into the field and sprayed it around the base of newly planted trees, and then had some trees that were not treated. And what we ended up finding out is that this anthraquinone treatment did work quite well. In fact, we had anywhere from a 10 to a 20-fold reduction in girdling damage from these anthraquinone treatments. And these treatments lasted for at least 6 weeks. I say at least 6 weeks because that's the total extent that we were able to continue to monitor. But I can tell you we had no uptick whatsoever in girdling damage after 6 weeks. And so I have every reason to believe that it will last for a lot longer than that. So this was pretty exciting, but it is an experimental product yet. It has not been registered, so don't go running out looking for anthraquinone as a vole repellent right now. But we're hopeful that within a few years it'll get registered. I've been saying this for a few years now, but it's a long, slow process in getting these products registered. A lot of testing that has to be done before EPA will approve it. So not sure when it will be available, but hopefully before too long, this will be another option for mitigating vole girdling damage. A product that is currently available is one for protecting subsurface drip irrigation from gopher damage. So I don't know if there's many of you on this presentation here, listening to this presentation here today, that utilize subsurface drip or SDI. But if you do, there is a repellent called Protect T that's available now. The active ingredient is methyl mercaptan. Basically, what happens is when you are, forcing water down through this subsurface drip tape, you eventually can introduce some of this Protect T to it, and then it's meant to kind of filter out and then deter gophers from that particular area. Gopher damage and subsurface drip irrigation, they do not go along well at all. Here's an example of drip tape that's just been chewed up and down, and it leads to these massive leaks out there. So gophers and SDI just do not work well, and so work well together. So we really need to mitigate that damage, and one potential option could be through the use of this kind of a repellent. We have not done extensive testing with this yet, but I did do some very minor testing early on and found a 41% reduction in gopher activity 1 month after treatment. So at least there's some data to suggest that there might be some potential benefits to utilizing this product, but I think we need to do a lot more testing to prove its effectiveness. But it is out there, and it's something that you can try. And then repellents are also one of the few tools that we have for trying to deter deer from a particular area. There's a wide variety of different kinds of repellents that are out there. They work to varying different degrees based on some of the studies that I've seen. Those that contain putrescent egg solids or that are fat-based products seem to work best. In particular, the one that has proven most effective so far is called Trico, and it's based on sheep tallow, a repellent based on sheep tallow. But the unfortunate side of that is it's still not registered in California. It's registered in 47 states, but California is one of the three where it is not. I mention it because I'm hopeful that it will get registered here in the not too distant future. But there are some others out there as well, that can work. Just keep in mind with repellents for deer, they do need to be reapplied at various intervals because rainfall can wash them away in some cases. Solar radiation will break down the product. Certainly, as new plant growth occurs, then that may not be protected by that repellent, etc. Likewise, there are limitations on when and where these repellents can be applied. And in some of these food crops for certain products, they can't be used during the bearing season. So you have to be careful, read the labels very thoroughly to understand what you can use and when you can use it. But when you can use it, they can provide at least some short-term relief from deer browse damage. Well, trapping is another tool that we commonly utilize to manage, particularly, some of these burrowing rodent species. With ground squirrels, there's a few different kinds of traps out there, but we basically can lump them into two categories, and those are your kill traps and your live traps. Examples of kill traps include body gripping traps like the Conibear 110, which oftentimes is placed around the entrance of a burrow system, and then that's meant to catch the ground squirrel when it runs in or out. There's also tube or tunnel style traps, which you can place along ground squirrel runways, sprinkle some bait down. All of these, the common thread for all of these is that if the squirrel runs in, it kills the squirrel. So that's the plus side. You don't have to euthanize the animal after capture. The downside is that they can be, indiscriminate traps. And so if a non-target species were to wander into one of these traps, it can kill them as well. So if you're trapping in an area where you are concerned about non-target captures, that includes pets as well, then you would probably want to focus on live traps instead. Examples of live traps include these tomahawk or have a heart style cage traps. There's also multi-catch traps, which will allow you to capture multiple squirrels at once, whereas these will only allow you to catch one squirrel at a time. These traps can definitely be effective at removing ground squirrels. The downside of these traps, though, is that if you do capture the target animal, you are responsible for euthanizing the animal. And this is a step that sometimes folks aren't always aware of. Sometimes they think that, if I catch a squirrel on my property, I can just take it to a local park and release it. But you can't do that. That is illegal. It's against California Fish and Game Code to translocate wildlife off of your property. So if you're going to utilize these traps, you do need to be prepared to euthanize the animal. But of course, we need to do so in a humane manner. And there are two techniques currently considered humane by the American Vet Association that would be suitable for use against ground squirrels. One of those options is shooting. So if you're in an area where you can legally discharge an animal or legally discharge a firearm, you could utilize shooting. There are some locations in which you can utilize a high-powered air rifle as well to euthanize the animal. But if you're in situations where that's not an option for you, then your other tool is the use of a carbon dioxide euthanasia chamber, which is simply a device where you take the trap with the animal in it, put it inside, pump carbon dioxide into it at a specified flow rate, which causes the animal to pass out from the exposure to the carbon dioxide and then eventually succumb to that exposure. If you want more information on this, I would encourage you to check out the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website, which I have the URL for that at the end of my presentation here today. It goes through that entire process for you. The last thing I will mention on this is that, sometimes these live traps are still actually sold with containers meant to drown the animal. It's important to note that drowning is no longer considered a humane form of euthanasia, but even more importantly, in the state of California, it is illegal to euthanize animals via drowning. So just be aware of that. Drowning is not an option. Now, we also extensively utilize trapping for pocket gopher management. In fact, I think trapping is one of the best tools we have for managing pocket gophers. There's a variety of different kinds of gopher traps out there as well, but they all basically fall into two categories, and those are squeeze type traps and pincher style traps. Examples of squeeze type traps would be these box traps like the Victor Black box. There's also the Gopher Hawk, which is a newer type trap that a lot of you are probably familiar with, and I would consider that to be a squeeze type trap. For pitcher style traps, we have, of course, the tried and true Maccabee, which has been around for well over 100 years. The Gophinator is a somewhat newer trap, been around for about 20 years. The Cinch trap is used a lot up in the North Coast area, um, including, Sonoma County and that area too. And it's been around for 100 years or so as well. Of course, a lot of the questions I initially got were, which traps are most effective? And so we did do some testing on this over the years. Some other folks have done some testing on some different kinds of traps as well. But ultimately, what we kind of focused on were some tests comparing the Maccabee to the Gophinator, because the Maccabee, at least at the time, was the most commonly used trap. And the Gophinator was a pretty new trap that seemed to have a lot of promise. And so we did test this extensively throughout the state in a variety of different locations. And what we ended up finding out is that the Gophinator trap actually worked better than the Maccabee trap. And it worked better because it allowed us to capture some of the larger gophers at a greater rate. And that's what this chart here at the bottom left is showcasing. You got the Gophinator with the solid line, the Maccabee with the dashed lines. Across the x-axis, we have different size classes of gophers, and the y-axis, we have capture rates. What you see is that for the smallest size class of gophers, both traps worked equally well, but as we got into the larger and larger size classes, we started to capture proportionally more and more when utilizing the Gophinator, to the point where when we got out to the largest size class of gophers, we were still catching them with the Gophinator, but we were no longer capturing any at all with the Maccabee. And this relationship was almost completely linear, indicating that for each size class up in gophers that we were catching about 23 to 25% more. That's for each size class up. So that disparity was growing as we went into those different size classes. So for me, the Gophinator is a really good trap, and it's the one that I've utilized for most of my other studies. We've also tested the importance of covering trap sets, or whether or not we could leave those trap sets open. The basic premise being that if you're covering a trap set, digging down, putting your traps, and then covering that back up, you're creating the illusion that there's nothing wrong within the tunnel system. So hopefully the gopher travels up and down the tunnels like it normally would and get caught at a high rate. Conversely, though, if you're digging those holes, setting the traps, and then leaving that trap set open, you could, in theory, be encouraging investigation of those trap sets, which could increase capture success too. So we looked at that again over a wide variety of different locations. And what we ended up finding out is that it actually didn't matter that much either way. We did have slightly higher capture efficiencies during the hottest times of the year when utilizing covered trap sets, but that slight increase in efficiency was offset by the amount of time it took to cover and uncover those trap sets, to the point that we were actually catching the same number per day utilizing both covered and uncovered trap sets. And as we moved into the cooler times of the year, so think late fall, winter, and early spring, we were actually catching slightly higher numbers when utilizing uncovered trap sets. And personally, I think, the best time of the year to trap is that late fall through early spring season, because you're, number one, getting them before one of their reproductive pulses occurs, but also you're getting them when you have high soil moisture, which means they're mounding more often. It's easier to find those active mounds, and it's easier to dig down and set traps. So for me personally, if I'm not concerned about non-target skating access to the traps, then I utilize open trap sets. But if you're trapping in, heavily trafficked areas with lots of kids or adults or pets, then you might want to consider covering those trap sets just to eliminate that potential risk. We've also looked at, various different kinds of attractants and whether or not those attractants might potentially be able to increase capture success. We did not see any real benefits to utilizing attractants. Turns out catching gophers is pretty easy regardless of whether or not you utilize any kind of an attractant. And we did look at human scent too. Do we need to exclude human scent from these traps and trap sets, or can we utilize bare hands and not worry about our ability to impact capture success? And in this case, the results were very clear. Human scent had no impact whatsoever on our ability to catch gophers. So we talked quite a bit about, some different strategies to increase our ability to capture gophers, but we still haven't talked about how efficacious trapping actually is. Turns out trapping is highly efficacious for gophers. In a couple of different settings, we looked at 3 different vineyards, we looked at 3 different alfalfa fields, And when combining them all, what we ended up finding out was that between 92 and 94, we were able to remove 92 to 94% of the gophers from all of these different sites. So it turns out trapping is highly efficacious. In fact, we took it one step further in alfalfa and did a third trapping session, and were able to remove 100% of the gophers in that scenario. So trapping really is a very efficacious tool. Now, another strategy that we have for managing burrowing rodents is bait application. Of course, with baiting, we're talking about the use of toxic baits or rodenticides in this case. We do have a few different options, but the laws and regs associated with rodenticides have changed quite a bit over the last few years and will continue to change in all likelihood over the next few years. So one of the big changes is that essentially all of these products are now restricted use products, except for a few situations for gophers for a homeowner application. Otherwise, anything else for ground squirrel, pocket gophers, and voles are considered to be restricted use products these days. Now, as far as options are concerned, we do have first generation anticoagulant rodenticide options for ground squirrels, pocket gophers, and voles. And likewise, we have zinc phosphide for all three of these species. These first generation anticoagulants include difascinone and chlorfascinone, and these are chronic feed materials. That means the animal generally needs to consume the bait over the course of several days to get a lethal dose. Contrast that to zinc phosphide, which is an acute toxicant. It kills after a single feed. Now, for gophers, we have one other option as well, and that's strychnine. Strychnine is also an acute toxicant, but strychnine is only available or allowable for use against pocket gophers. Now, when it comes to ground squirrel control and vole control, one of the products that we can use are these first generation anticoagulants. First generation anticoagulants can be applied in one of three methods. Those are spot treatments, broadcast applications, or in bait stations. Spot treatments are used when we have relatively few burrow systems to treat. With spot treatments, what we're generally doing is taking a designated amount of bait and spreading it very thinly around the burrow entrance. Usually it means 1/3 cup of bait spread around a 40 to 50 square foot area. So when we're applying it at that application rate, that usually results in 6 to 8 pieces of grain per square foot. Obviously, you can tell that by looking at this photo in the bottom left, this is an example of what not to do when it comes to a spot treatment. In this case, somebody actually just piled up bait around the entrance of all of these burrow systems. And this is a very hazardous situation because any animal can come along and get enough of this to get a lethal dose. However, if you're applying it in the specified manner with just a few pieces of grain per square foot, there are very few animals that are adapted to be able to pick up enough of this grain to get a lethal dose, which is why we've been able to utilize it for years effectively and safely. But these misapplications, this is where we run into substantial issues. Well, this is fine if we have just a few burrow systems to treat, but if we have larger areas to treat, then we'll oftentimes utilize a broadcast application, which is where we use a seed spreader that's been specifically calibrated to distribute grain bait or pelletized bait at a specified flow rate in order to be able to target ground squirrel or vole control. Again, our target is going to be around 6 to 8 pieces of grain per square foot. This is typically utilized either in rangeland settings or alongside fence rows and roadsides and places like that. These days, though, most of our bait applications as it pertains to these first generation anticoagulants is conducted through the use of bait stations, which of course bait stations house bait within and that allow access to only those animals small enough to be able to get inside that bait station. And so this is what we primarily use in orchard and vineyard settings, oftentimes used along fence rows as well to intercept reinvaders that might move into your property. Just keep in mind that, with these first generation anticoagulants, again, these are chronic feed materials. And so with bait stations, you have to maintain a constant bait supply. You can't just put bait in these stations and then forget about it and come back a month later and look and see, oh, all the bait's gone. Because if the squirrels eat all the bait on days 1 and 2, then they're probably not getting enough of it over the course of a 4 or 5 day period for that to work. So you do need to check and make sure you're maintaining that constant bait supply. Likewise, if you're utilizing spot treatments or broadcast applications, you need to apply a second time. Read the label. It will tell you when exactly, but usually it's 4 days after the initial application. The last thing I'll mention on these first generation anticoagulants is that there has been a lot of regulatory and legislative actions taken to minimize their use. In particular, Assembly Bills 1322 and 2552 have been passed over the last 2 years that have placed a moratorium on the use of these first generation anticoagulants. However, there are exemptions for their use in production ag situations. And since that's the audience I'm primarily talking to here today, understand that these are tools that you can still utilize in production ag situations. But if you're not in production ag, then their uses are limited, in most cases, not allowable. Although there are some other carve-outs, such as protection of human health and safety, water conveyance structures, et cetera. So certainly look into those legal actions if you're looking for more information on that. The other toxicant that we can use for ground squirrels and voles is zinc phosphide. Zinc phosphide is an acute toxicant. It kills after a single feed. The downside with zinc phosphide is that it kind of has a distinctive odor to it and taste as well that the animals don't necessarily always like. And so sometimes they'll engage in some exploratory feeding where they might eat a couple pieces of grain. Well, that's enough to cause the animal to get sick, but not enough to kill it. And so then when it gets sick, it learned that it got sick from eating this weird tasting food, and then it doesn't want to feed on it again. So very similar to how anthraquinone works, right? So because of that, we have to be careful how we utilize zinc phosphide. You should be pre-baiting first with clean grain initially to make sure that the animals are going to regularly feed on that product. That also allows you the opportunity to determine if there's non-targets potentially feeding on that grain. If there are, then you do not want to follow up with a zinc phosphide application. You need to come up with another strategy. But that pre-baiting also serves as a way to get the animals used to feeding on this product, so then if you follow up with a zinc phosphide application, it's going to be more likely to work. Also, most of the labels do not allow for the use of zinc phosphide within bait stations because it's been a long-held belief that bait stations will magnify that odor and make it less effective. However, I will say that I've been doing some testing on this recently and not necessarily finding that to be true, but our testing is pretty early on. We're going to do some more testing here in the future. But it's possible that there may be some allowances for its use in bait stations sometime in the future. And there are some labels that do allow for its use in bait stations right now, but a lot of labels do not. So just check the labels to figure that out. But lastly, keep in mind it is an acutely toxic material, so it's not to be used in or around buildings. And then, of course, we can use bait application for gophers as well. I mentioned the options that are out there, but I can tell you that strychnine is by far the most efficacious. So if I was going to utilize a bait for gopher control, I would definitely be focusing on strychnine. The funnel and spoon method is fine if you have a few bait stations to treat, but if we're talking about larger areas, folks, we'll generally utilize one of these all-in-one probe and bait dispensers, which allow you to probe directly into the tunnel system. You then crank a lever which deposits a preset amount of bait directly into that tunnel system, allowing you to treat multiple burrow systems more rapidly. And then there are these burrow builders, which can also be used, which create an artificial tunnel and deposit preset amounts of bait within that tunnel system. So that allows you to treat areas more rapidly, but it's a little bit more hit or miss from an efficacy perspective. So it's not always necessarily the most efficacious option. The last tool I'm going to talk about here today is burrow fumigation. We've already talked a little bit about it from the perspective that it utilizes toxic gases within burrow systems, and soil moisture is really key. So if we're thinking about the utilization of burrow fumigants, the best time of year is late winter, early spring for gophers, or after ground squirrels emerge from hibernation in the springtime. One of the key aspects about fumigants, though, is that they should not be used in or around buildings. We don't know where these burrow systems go. Sometimes they can go up and underneath structures. And if we apply a fumigant within one of those tunnel systems, then that gas can leak up into that structure and be problematic for humans, pets, livestock, etc. So don't use them around buildings. How far you need to be away from those structures depends on the product that you're utilizing. So be sure to read the labels and understand that. As far as fumigation options, we do have gas cartridges, which are essentially glorified smoke bombs. Creates a lot of smoke. You shove that down on the burrow system. It's meant to asphyxiate the animal. Works relatively well for ground squirrels, let's say 70 to 75% efficacy, so that's pretty good. One of the great things about them too is that they are not a restricted use product, so you don't have to be a certified applicator to utilize them. However, they're a little bit more expensive than some of the other options like aluminum phosphide. So if you have extensive problems with ground squirrels or gophers, aluminum phosphide tends to be the more effective option. In fact, this is a highly efficacious material. We see 97 to 100% efficacy for ground squirrels and 90 to 100% efficacy for gophers. One of the best tools we have out there, but it is by far the most restrictive product that we have. You certainly have to be a certified applicator. File your notice of intent, pesticide use report, file a fumigation management plan. You generally have to post areas for 48 hours, and there's some other steps as well that you have to take. So a little bit more restrictive from that perspective. More recently, we've had the advent of pressurized exhaust machines, such as the Perk machine, the Kojak, the Burrow RX, and the Cheetah rodent controller. These are all devices that create exhaust which is laden with carbon monoxide, which is then injected into the burrow systems. As far as efficacy, we've seen pretty good results for gophers, I would say, 60 to 65% on average. So not as good as some other tools. You know, trapping aluminum phosphide are definitely better. Strychnine's probably a little bit better too. But the great thing about some of these devices like the Perk machine and the Kojak is that they allow you to treat multiple burrow systems at once. Depending upon the size of the machine that you get, you can treat up to 6 burrow systems at a time. And so we have shown that you can treat areas more rapidly with these devices than most other options. And so even though efficacy might not be quite as high, you get that potential benefit. They, however, work quite well for ground squirrels. In ideal moist soil conditions, we've had 100% efficacy with the Perk machine. And even in hot, dry conditions when burrow fumigants generally do not work well at all, we've gotten fairly good results with the Perk machine. Certainly much better when you have ideal soil conditions, but even in dry conditions, we got some level of efficacy. So I think they work really well for ground squirrel control. Lastly, you know, I think these three devices, the Perk, the Kojak, and the Burrow RX are probably all fairly similar in efficacy. But we did also test this Cheetah rodent controller. And as you can see, we actually ended up with more ground squirrels after treatment than before treatment. So this one did not seem to work quite as well. The last device I'm going to mention is a carbon dioxide injection device, which was legalized a couple of years ago. This one's called the Eliminator. In this case, you have to carry around a canister of CO2, and then you use a hose and a probe to inject that into the burrow system. Efficacy seems to be pretty similar to that for the pressurized exhaust machines, although it has not been tested quite as extensively. However, these carbon dioxide injection devices have a couple of potential disadvantages. One of them is that you have to have a canister of CO2, and that canister has to be specifically labeled as a pesticide, and very few places actually sell that. Woodland, here where I live, actually is one of the few places nationally that actually sells this. So there are some substantial limitations there. Also, because it is considered a pesticide, there are some additional restrictions for its use. And in particular, DPR approved some new regulations this year when it comes to burrow fumigation. Essentially, now you have to have a category M along with your QAC or QAL, or if you have a PAC, there's another test that you have to take in order to be able to utilize some of these fumigation options. And one of the ones that you have to have that special certification for is this carbon dioxide injection device. It also applies to aluminum phosphide. Incidentally, though, it does not apply to these pressurized exhaust machines because they are not considered a pesticide, they are considered a device. And so you don't have to have that category M to utilize these. You also do not have to have them for the gas cartridges. So there are some exceptions there. So that's the material that I have for us here today. I did just want to quickly mention, if you want more information about ground squirrels, please check out the Ground Squirrel Best Management Practices website. It's meant to be your one-stop shop when it comes to managing ground squirrels, all kinds of great information, including calculating CO2 flow for euthanasia chambers, etc. And if you want more information on some of these other species, such as voles and gophers, I would encourage you to check out the Vertebrate Pest Control Handbook. So that's what I have here today. It looks like I might have a minute or so left. I don't know. That's up to Cindy to decide if I got time
Well,
for questions.
So Roger, you're at time. Thank you so much for your presentation. I am launching the next poll for over the break. We do have quite a few questions, though. If you don't mind opening up the Q&A and responding to those questions directly, but we are at time for taking the questions over the video. We're going to be breaking right now, and we'll be coming back at 10:15. Were you able to open up the Q&A?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. You have some good questions in there.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.